As if the destruction and death of the Second World War was not enough, the war occurred simultaneously with the largest mass genocide in world history. It is impossible to separate the Holocaust from the broader study of the Second World War, but neither should the Holocaust be simply considered just another part of the war, just some more war-related casualties. Rather, Nazi Germany intentionally and purposefully embarked on a systemic plan to exterminate an entire historic population in Europe and employed ruthless efficiency and professionalism to accomplish it. The Holocaust added to the horror of the war and to the millions that perished due to genocidal ideology. The roots of the Holocaust can be found in a deep and historic strain of anti-Semitism that has characterized the European continent since the early Middle Ages. European Jews historically were viewed with suspicion or outright persecuted for their differences in ethnicity and religion. The Nazis borrowed from these long historic roots of anti-Semitism and expanded them into present ideas. Aryanism was the racial ideology the Nazis used to justify the invasion of their neighbors and the extermination of undesired populations. It was, to be sure, a fabricated ideology, with no anthropological or ethnical roots. Nevertheless, Hitler and the Nazis propagated the idea that a master race or ethnicity did exist and was composed of ethnically pure Germans with some connections to Nordic and Saxon peoples. The blonde-haired and blue-eyed Aryan was advertised as the most pure of all racial categories. The Nazis authorized a multitude of quack racial scientists to promulgate ideas regarding racial superiority and to categorize certain races, particularly Jews and Africans, as inferior to the pure Aryan. Noses, foreheads, and eye levels were measured and calibrated in some fruitless effort to identify differences and inherent qualities. Popular ideology evolved into legal policy in 1934 with the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. It is evident that the Nazis first implemented some of their ideology emphasizing the superiority of some over others by targeting the weak, old, infirm, and disabled in German society. The 1934 law mandated forcible sterilization on those deemed to carry a hereditary defect that they would pass on to their offspring. Among diseases considered hereditary were mental impairments, schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, and chronic epilepsy. The law allowed Nazi doctors broad discretion in determining what was hereditary and what required mandatory sterilization. Identification and sterilization evolved very quickly into elimination. The Action T4 program empowered physicians to diagnose the chronically sick and instead of letting them be a burden on the state, have the patients receive a mercy killing to eliminate the chance of contaminating the supposed pure German bloodline. Adolf Hitler personally signed the order to commence the Action T4 program in September of 1939. Close to 300,000 people, mostly patients in psychiatric hospitals, were murdered as a result of the Action T4 program. The program was justified through an extensive propaganda effort featuring posters such as the one shown here. Featuring an infirm man in front of a doctor, the poster reads, 60,000 Reichsmark is what the hereditarily ill person cost the community during his lifetime. Fellow citizen, that is your money too. Read News Vogue, the monthly magazine of the Bureau for Race Politics of the Nazi Party. In a society that came to venerate cruelty, conquering, and mass extermination, the Nazi doctors who implemented the Action T4 program were among the worst. Providing an abundance of quack medical research coupled with plenty of excuses and euphemisms, the Nazi doctors implemented the T4 program without any regard for its victims and the consequences of their actions. Popular disgust with the program led to the official termination of T4 in 1941, but in reality the program continued in secret by various Nazi doctors until the end of the war in 1945. The program targeted the most vulnerable members of society who never knew what was being perpetrated against them and certainly could not prevent it. Children who were mentally handicapped or who had Down syndrome were judged to be expendable and the subject of cruel and experimental medical treatments. Many were deliberately euthanized apart from the permission of their parents. Many were orphans with nobody to advocate for them. Vulnerable patients were subjected to so-called research. Patients had their lymph nodes removed and therefore their immune systems compromised, and then they were injected with tuberculosis to see how long they could survive. Full lobotomies were performed on mentally handicapped children, and then the patients were discarded once the experiment would go awry. One euthanizing center in Nazi Germany that was used extensively to implement the T4 program was Hadamar in the state of Hessen in central Germany. The crimes perpetrated at Hadamar commenced with mass sterilizations of children deemed unfit to reproduce. Thereafter, children who were deemed unfit were exterminated, and then, eventually, the adults. A crude gas chamber was constructed at Hadamar where carbon dioxide was pumped in to asphyxiate its victims. Bodies were then transported to the crematorium for incineration. Almost every day, nearly 100 victims would arrive on concealed buses that would pull into concealed garages or behind high walls. The unwitting victims would be unloaded, processed, examined, quickly diagnosed, and then sent for extermination. By 1941, 10,000 victims had already been exterminated at Hadamar. Hadamar demonstrated to the Nazis how killing through gas could be performed on an industrial scale and would eventually be expanded into a larger program at concentration camps. The Nazis moved their ideas on Aryan supremacy to more deliberately target race with the passage of the Nuremberg race laws in 1935. The laws were designed to reduce the contamination of the Aryan peoples and were specific enough to root out Jews in the population and commence their mass identification and discrimination. By the terms of the laws, marriages between Jews and German citizens were forbidden. Relationships between Jews and Germans were forbidden. Jews were forbidden to fly the Reich flag or colors. Jews were forbidden to employ young Germans as servants. German citizens were expected to faithfully serve the state. The laws provided for the classification of pure German citizens. Perhaps most ominously, classifications for Jews were also published. Thereafter, Jews were supposed to self-identify and self-report themselves. German citizens could identify to what degree they were Jewish by following the fabricated charts that were published to coincide with the Nuremberg race laws. For example, a person who is 1/8 Jewish was considered as belonging to the German race and approved to have Reich citizenship. A person who is 1/4 Jewish only partly belonged to the German race and was still approved to have citizenship. But a person who was 3/4 Jewish was considered Jewish and belonging to the Jewish community and could not enjoy German citizenship. By 1941, German Jews were required by law to self-identify by wearing the infamous Yellow Star of David. Identification quickly evolved into discrimination and ostracism, as previously friendly German neighbors were now less inclined to socialize with Jews or conduct business with them. Ostracism devolved into violence in early November 1938 during Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht refers to the large-scale pogrom or anti-Jewish riot that occurred on the night of November 9th and 10th in 1938. The word Kristallnacht means crystal glass and refers to the abundance of glass that littered the streets after Jews had their homes, businesses, and synagogues smashed and windows broken by Nazi troops. The pretext for the pogrom was the assassination of a low-level Nazi diplomatic figure in Paris by a Polish Jew. Thereafter, large crowds indiscriminately attacked Jews and their property at the instigation and with the assistance of Nazi stormtroopers. Quite often, the party soldiery and local police simply looked on as the rioters destroyed so much private Jewish property. Over 7,000 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed. Over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Local police departments recorded a large number of murders and rapes. Participants in Kristallnacht destroyed almost 300 synagogues in Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Tombstones were uprooted, and graves were violated. Timeless and historic scrolls of the Torah were looted, burned, or simply trashed. Perhaps upwards of 600 Jews died in the pogrom, with many of them suicides, as a disconsolate community struggled to feel positive about the fate of Jews in the future of Nazi Germany. This chart might help to indicate how anti-Semitism evolved from an ideology to a program of mass extermination. There were strong strains of anti-Semitism in 19th century Europe in several countries, including England and France, but particularly in Russia. Pogroms were so frequent and so severe in parts of Russia that some Jews fled their homeland to come to a safer place, such as Germany. A new, more powerful myth emerged in Germany, however, in the wake of that nation's defeat in the First World War. The so-called stab-in-the-back myth was the fabricated narrative that the heroic German army was poised for victory during the war, but was suddenly deprived of victory because it was stabbed in the back by a group of Jews who had infiltrated the government back home. The myth was utterly untrue because Germany was rapidly retreating and on the verge of starvation in the final months of the war, and had to surrender. But the myth nevertheless carried great appeal to a citizenry and corps of veterans who had been humiliated by the end of the war. This growing ideological antagonism towards Jews was codified into law by the 1935 race laws, which led to the events of Kristallnacht. The identification laws only made targeted violence easier to execute, and therefore incarceration into detention centers easily followed. Prisons were initially effective for rounding up a specific population, but once the numbers became too large, cordoning off entire neighborhoods into ghettos became an effective means to consolidate more people. The Warsaw Ghetto is the best example of this step. Mass incarceration into overpacked ghettos facilitated the last step, which was the systematic transport and then extermination at camps such as Auschwitz, which were built for the purposes of mass elimination. Even a quick glance at the Nazi procedures employed during the Holocaust present a stunning model of efficiency and effectiveness that yielded horrifying results. The Jews of Europe were the primary target of Nazi extermination, and the ethnic group would suffer the greatest losses, with 6 million Jews of Europe exterminated by the Nazis. But the Nazis also deployed their professional means of genocide against other groups in conquered territories. The Roma, or in the past called by the pejorative term gypsies, were a nomadic itinerant ethnicity that was predominantly in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. The Nuremberg laws specified that the Roma had no place in a race-based state, and thus were purged as part of the Holocaust. Several 100,000 Roma were killed by the Nazis during World War II, eliminating close to half of the pre-war Romani population of Europe. Poles incurred much of the contempt and rage of Hitler during the war, with large segments of the Polish population recklessly bombed and intentionally shot. Hitler believed Poles were an inferior race, and that the lands of Poland would be put to better use by giving them to the racially superior Germans. The chronically sick, or those designated incurables, were also targeted right from the beginning of the Nazi era. Those with hereditary diseases would not be permitted to contaminate the gene pool of the superior German, and thus they were deliberately euthanized, even if they were ethnic Germans. Although homosexuality had been legal and was openly celebrated in Weimar Berlin, once the Nazis took power, homosexuality was designated a criminal behavior. Gay establishments were shut down, and gay men who were denounced to Nazi authorities were prosecuted and imprisoned. It is difficult to know how many homosexuals were executed by the Nazis, but estimates range in the several 10,000s. Jehovah's Witnesses were the only group in Nazi Germany specifically targeted for their religious beliefs, as they refused to perform military service, join Nazi organizations, or pledge allegiance to Adolf Hitler. An estimated 10,000 witnesses were arrested during the Nazi era for their beliefs. 2,000 were incarcerated, and perhaps 1,200 died in custody. Perhaps 250 were purposely shot for their beliefs. Hitler also held racial contempt for Russian and Slavic peoples and believed the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 in Russia was a Jewish revolution. Thus, for ethnic and ideological reasons, Soviet prisoners of war were held in deplorable conditions, malnourished, and deliberately shot during the German invasion of Russia. A significant step towards accelerating the Holocaust occurred in a Berlin suburb named Wannsee in 1942. There, the chief of the Reich Security main office, Reinhard Heydrich, called together numerous ministers to get their cooperation for implementing the destruction of Europe's Jews. The meeting was secret, but the latter discovered minutes to the meeting included the recording of the notorious euphemism that the Nazis would use repeatedly to refer to the settlement of the Jewish problem. The final solution was a phrase that emerged from the Wannsee Conference and invoked a belief that extermination would at long last deal with what the Nazis deemed to be the problem of European Jewry. Other solutions have been proposed in the past, but now the final solution, that is mass genocide, would at last deal with the perceived problem. Although incarceration, torture, and execution was already occurring against Jews in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, as the Nazis conquered additional territories in order to implement the final solution, they found it necessary to designate special military units that would see to the mass murder of Jews in conquered territories. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile military units that traveled with the German army and were tasked with the roundup and elimination of undesirable ethnic groups and other undesirable peoples. These SS death squads were originally ordered to shoot their victims and thoroughly eliminate those judged to be undesirable to the Reich in any of the conquered territories. The Einsatzgruppen were under the command of SS leader Heinrich Himmler and senior group leader Reinhard Heydrich, and were ordered to work closely with the German army to fulfill their task. After the German army conquered a village or town, an affiliated Einsatzgruppen squad would move into the area behind the army and round up all the Jews and undesirables from the local area. Locals often gave up their Jews to the Nazis in the hopes of receiving favorable treatment. The arrested were then brought to the outskirts of town, perhaps to a ditch, gully, or open field, where they were lined up and then shot by an SS firing squad. Historians estimate that the Einsatzgruppen killed around 2 million people during the course of the war, 1.3 million of which were Jews. Some of the more notable mass murders considered by the Einsatzgruppen occurred at Babyn Yar, Mizoch, and Ivanhorod in the Ukraine. Babyn Yar refers to a large ravine outside the city of Kiev in the Ukraine. After the Nazis took control of the city, Einsatzgruppen commandos rounded up local Jews and sent them to the ravine. There, they were machine-gunned. The Nazis continued to use the ravine as an execution site for more Jews the longer they remained in Ukraine, and sent them as well to Babyn Yar. Soviet POWs are being forced in this picture by Nazi guards to cover up the mass grave. On September 29th to 30th, 1941, over 33,000 Jews were murdered at this site. By the end of the German occupation of the Ukraine, it is estimated that between 100,000 and 150,000 Jews were massacred at Babyn Yar. One of the more horrific killings conducted by the death squads occurred in western Ukraine in a small town named Mizoch. On October 14, 1942, Jews from the Mizoch ghetto were rounded up with the assistance of German police and Ukrainian troops and brought to a ravine outside of town. The Jewish women and children were ordered to undress and surrender their belongings, including any valuables such as wedding rings and jewelry. The now naked women and children were separated into groups and led to the base of the ditch. Standing on the ridge above, Einsatzgruppen troops proceeded to open up their machine guns on the helpless victims below. After the shooting stopped, additional troops walked into the ravine and ensured that all were dead. This German policeman prepares to finish off 2 Jewish children who are not yet dead. Over 1,700 Jews were evacuated from the Mizoch ghetto, marched into this ravine and murdered. Their remains lie beneath the back-filled ravine still today. In a war famous for its iconic photographs, this photo, too, infamously captures the evil of the Holocaust in a horrific way. A woman is attempting to protect a child with her own body just before they are fired upon with rifles at close range. This photo was taken near Horod, Ukraine in 1942, probably by a fellow German soldier. In an effort to confirm the efficiency of their work and that they were carrying out orders, Einsatzgruppen troops kept meticulous records of their killings, took numerous photographs, and even video recorded their killings. Their own records would later incriminate themselves in war crime trials after the war. While the death squads were remarkably efficient and horrifically productive in their efforts to murder as many as possible in Eastern Europe, the strain of personally shooting so many people on a daily basis became a psychological strain on Einsatzgruppen troops. Soldiers resorted to drinking heavily and even ingesting amphetamines to keep on killing. But even then, the numbers exterminated could not match the demands of Heinrich Himmler and the SS leadership. To reduce the psychological strain on the troops and the strain of individually shooting people every day, the death squads began experimenting with poison gas to kill larger numbers of people at a time. Trucks were converted into gas chambers in which multiple people could be loaded, the doors were sealed, and then the CO2 from the exhaust pipe was pumped into the van. After all inside were dead, the doors would be opened and the victims' bodies would be discarded. The gas vans relieved some of the psychological strain on the Einsatzgruppen, but the gas vans still could not exterminate people on a large scale as the Nazis wished. SS leadership therefore turned to establishing sites for mass extermination. Instead of Jews and other desirables being exterminated where they were found, the Nazis changed their approach in which victims would be transported to concentration camps, converted to death camps, and there, on a large scale, they would be eliminated. All across Germany, but particularly occupied Poland, former barracks, bases, prisons, and camps were converted into sites designed for mass murder. The Nazis perfected killing people on an industrial scale, and the horror stories that would emerge from the camps during the war would educate the world regarding man's capacity for evil and his ability to inflict that evil on his fellow man.